Day is now higher after comments made by senior figures in government. The Prime Minister's described the planned demonstration in central London as provocative, saying he'll hold the Met Police Commissioner accountable should any problems arise on Saturday. Suella Braverman's also previously called pro-Palestinian rallies hate marches. Jackie Smith has told us they're not helping the situation.
I suspect the Commissioner, if he was feeling particularly brave, might have said to the Prime Minister, frankly, it is now more likely that there will be conflict or even violence because the actions of the Home Secretary have essentially prompted people like Tommy Robinson and others to say, right, well, we're going to weigh in as well and we're going to turn up. That would be quite a serious position to be in.
The head of the RMT has told us he will not recommend an agreement with rail operators, which could see strikes paused. Mick Lynch says union members will be asked to vote on the plans, but thinks the pay offer is too low. The most senior civil servant at the start of the pandemic has apologised for his suggestion of chickenpox parties to promote herd immunity. Lord Sedwill has been giving evidence to the COVID inquiry. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 8 points at 74.01. The pound buys $1.22 and euro 14. LBC weather, rain slowly clearing in the southeast tonight, blustery showers in the west and a low of 1. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening and welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. Let me introduce you to my panel. On my immediate left, Baroness Angela Smith, Labour's leader in the House of Lords. To her left, David Simmonds, Conservative MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner. He chairs the all-party Parliamentary group on migration. To my right, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, political reporter for PoliticsHome, and Freddie Sayers, editor-in-chief of the news and opinion website UnHerd.com. And there's no A in herd, so UNHE. How many times do you have to?
Every time.
Every time. I think you should have a renaming ceremony. Right, we will take many of your questions over the course of the next 58 minutes. If you'd like to put a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And we'd love you to watch us on Global Player 2.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first question. It's from Shahed in Tower Hamlets. Hello, Shahed.
Hi, Ian. You all right?
Hi, not bad. What would you like to say?
Yeah. I mean, do you not agree, or your panel, do you not agree that the rhetoric that Suella Braverman has been pouting out of her mouth for the last few days, this phrase that she's caught on to, hate marches, is extremely dangerous and is her following in the footsteps of Donald Trump in America, who took people, to a very dangerous situation where all these people rioted in Capitol Hill, broke into the building and all that. Because you've got two sides to it. You've got people like me who go through these marches because we feel helpless. We have no other way of expressing how angry and how hurt and, crying we feel by seeing all these images coming from Gaza every day. And then you've got people like Tommy and his racist brigade who are now also threatening to come along and disrupt these marches. Yeah? And I believe that as Home Secretary, she should be much more responsible in the language she chooses to use. She has continuously, not by mistake, but intentionally provoking people on both sides by using the term hate march.
All right. Well, she's also said a few other things. We covered that last night on her comments on homelessness. David Simmonds, clearly Suella Braverman has her supporters among Conservative MPs, but I think there's a lot of disquiet among some of your colleagues about a lot of the rhetoric that she uses. A hurricane of migrants, I think, was one as well. What's your view?
Well, a lot of these issues are incredibly sensitive and complex, and particularly with what's going on between Gaza, Israel, and that wider context, it's time for us to have a sense of balance and proportion and calm about this. And I think the government's absolutely spot on to say we stand with Israel. The terrorist attacks that took place have no moral equivalence with the security operation that Israel is undertaking, especially when there are large numbers of Israeli citizens and other citizens, including British ones, who are held as hostage. But we need to make sure that we continue to hold Israel and others to account for following international law. And we need to make sure that the way
we might get onto that a bit later, but just
that broader
specifically on
situation.
Suella Braverman, is she effectively emulating Donald Trump in her language?
Well, certainly she seems to be emulating Donald Trump to a degree, and there are people out there who respond to that. That's exactly what they want to hear. But I think overall, as a government, we want to make sure that people are able to enjoy their right to free speech, their right to protest, and also that on what is a very important day of national remembrance, that happens peacefully, and everybody who needs to be there and wants to be there is able to enjoy that peacefully. And the more that we can do to ensure that that is what happened, the outcome that everyone wants to see, the better it will be.
And, I mean, can you tell us, I mean, I'm sure you've been talking to colleagues about this over the past, or maybe not just over the last few days. Is there quite a lot of disquiet about her performance as Home Secretary?
There's a lot of good things that have happened. I think if we look, for example, at what's happened with passport delays, that's come down dramatically. We've seen a significant increase in the pace at which asylum decisions are being made by the Home Office. And all of those reflect the fact that the government wants to show and is getting on with the job, really, that it needs to do competently. And, of course, that is balanced against the wider context of political debate. Now, Suella is a very senior minister. She's entitled to express opinions, and clearly those do resonate with people, but they're not necessarily the language that all parliamentarians would choose to use.
Would you like to see her moved or sacked in a reshuffle?
I think that's a decision for the Prime Minister.
Well, we know that. I'm asking for your opinion. If you were Prime Minister...
My opinion is that it's a decision for the Prime Minister.
OK, I don't think I'm going to get very far on that.
That's a tough question,
well,
really.
I know. That's what I'm here to do. Angela.
Yeah, I can answer that one if you want me to. I just think it's appalling that she is making the job of the police harder. She is saying that everybody on these marches is marching because of hate, and that clearly isn't the case. And so the things she says she doesn't want, she makes more likely in her language and behaviour. You know, there's the idea that people who are homeless, it's a lifestyle choice. I think she's a liability for the government. Now, David's made a good fist of it, but you really can't defend the way she behaves. She's not fit to be Home Secretary. He was making a good fist of it by trying to avoid it, and I would do the same in his position probably. But she isn't fit to be Home Secretary. Home Secretary wants to have a thought. You want the country to be calm. You want the country to be in good order. You should be supporting the police so they can do their job well. Nobody at all wants to see any remembrance weekend events disrupted or made less comfortable and easier for people to remember loved ones and those that have died. It's really important. But that's not what she's about. And I'd like to think there's a sort of generous interpretation that she doesn't think before she speaks and something comes out and it's just careless. It isn't. I think this is calculated. I think it's deliberate. And the constituency that she is talking to, it's not the country as a whole. It's to a small section of Conservative MPs that she wants to vote for her to be leader of the Conservative Party one day.
It's an odd strategy, though, because if that is a strategy, and I've got no reason to think it isn't, there is a small group of the Conservative Party, whether it's MPs or the Voluntary Party, who would respond to this type of rhetoric, but there's a much bigger group that won't.
I think with MPs, you're right, but remember the Conservative Party voted for Liz Truss rather than Rishi Sunak. It was only because she made such a hash of it.
Remorse there,
well, I think there may well be, but it was only because she made such a hash of it that Rishi Sunak took over. Her strategy isn't great if that's what it is, but I suspect she is playing to a gallery that may well see through her in the end, but I really don't think she's fit to be Home Secretary.
Freddie says.
Whatever Suella Braverman is doing, it's working quite well for her, dare I say it, if you want to be political about this. You mentioned Donald Trump. The lesson for people who strongly disagree with characters like Donald Trump is don't repeat the mistakes the Democrats made when dealing with him. You know, to just throw your arms up and say this is appalling, they're not fit to be in office, normal people would never support these ideas, generally boosts them. And in the case of Suella Braverman, you remember she threw her hat in the ring the last leadership election and no one even took it seriously. She announced it on Radio 4, I think it was, and it sort of disappeared without trace. This time, if there is going to be another leadership election, she is a contender, so it is working for her. So I guess my point would be, if you disagree with her, you're only going to help her if you throw your arms up and get appalled. What you need to do is listen to those issues she's raising and actually deliver some solutions. And in the case of immigration, which is the one she talks most about, it's not the case that a tiny portion of the population is anxious about it. Most of the population is anxious about it, and most people would like levels of immigration to come down, which is a legitimate political belief. And I think the more the mainstream delivers for those kind of people, the less characters like Suella Braverman are going to flourish.
But the two most recent things she has said is to describe everybody's on these marches as going on hate marches, and that people who are homeless have made a lifestyle choice. That's not to do with immigration. That is just unhelpful rhetoric from the Prime Minister.
And I try to be sometimes.
Yes, it's to be hard for you,
to be fair to her on that, she did say people who live in tents who are homeless, that's a lifestyle choice. She didn't actually say that for every homeless person it was a lifestyle choice.
That's all right then, is it?
No, I'm just look. I'm trying to. If I don't correct you when you say something that slightly stretches the actuality, then I get slagged off.
It's probably important to say, and also she was talking about people living in tents in two specific US cities that she was describing, if you listen to the interview. And she was highlighting a genuine concern that we know, for example, on immigration, which I mentioned earlier on, a significant number of those people who are getting a decision then have nowhere to go. And we don't want to have a situation where they're left sleeping in tents, so we do need to address it. And it's not about expressing hatred or disdain for those people. It's about good public policy solutions that mean people are not left on the streets.
Nadine.
I do think that one of the functions Suella Braverman has played in Rishi Sunak's government is saying things that feel quite, to some people outrageous on immigration, on certain topics that are quite inflammatory, and therefore Rishi Sunak therefore has a level of distance from them because it's his Home Secretary that said it, and he's not said it, and he may not directly repeat the words, but she's in his cabinet, and therefore that appeals to a certain base. And
so she's a kite flyer and a lightning conductor.
I feel to some extent there have been times, particularly on things like immigration, where Suella has got away with saying things where Rishi probably wouldn't have said them in his kind of bid to come across as having integrity and accountability and all of that sort of stuff. But I do think, particularly on the comments on homelessness, and I think maybe less on the protest stuff, actually. I'd say more the homelessness stuff. I do feel like she's kind of freelanced a bit too much. And that's when you get people like Claire Coutinho who've gone out, who are quite close to Rishi Sunak, who are kind of distancing themselves a bit from her comments. So I think he kind of plays, it feels sometimes observing it a bit with fire with Suella Braverman, in that she's useful when it comes to putting through certain policies in an angle to appeal to a certain base. But the flip side of that is she can go out and freelance and start saying things about, people sleeping in tents that will, turn a lot of voters off. And I think one of the core risks they have with Rishi Sunak has with Suella Braverman going into the next election now is losing voters, to his left in terms of, the Tory party. Is at risk of losing voters to the Liberal Democrats, and there will be a lot of Conservative voters in the home counties who are involved with charity work and homelessness, who see a Home Secretary with that sort of rhetoric and are turned off by that. So I think as we get closer, perhaps Suella Braverman's position may not be as secure as it has been in the last few months.
On the tents question, though, I've actually just got back from San Francisco. We did a special report for UnHerd on the homeless situation there. And I think it's important to say that it's not kind or good policy to allow people to camp long-term on the streets. And that's what they've done in San Francisco. And it really is shocking, the state of what we went around a district called the Tenderloin District. Children going to school have to be accompanied by security there. The drug taking is open on the street, and the general state of the security of the city is really, really compromised. So although it sounds kind, I don't think it is. And I think on the principle of camping long-term on the street, that shouldn't be allowed. There must be better solutions for people who are homeless.
What about her future, though? Because I was talking to a political editor today who says that Number 10 are now considering her position. And I was thinking, well, what's taken them so long? But do you think that she will survive a reshuffle as Home Secretary? I
think it's more likely she walks out, actually. I mean, I think the thing to watch for is this Supreme Court judgment on the policy regarding Rwanda. And if that comes down, I think it's coming up in a few weeks, if that comes down saying it's illegal, there'll then be a showdown moment between her and the Prime Minister saying, will Rishi commit to leaving the European Court of Human Rights a proper policy for the next Tory government? If he doesn't do that, my guess is she'll probably walk out and make that the beginning of her leadership campaign.
Nadine?
I think as we get close to the election, her position is probably less safe than it was a year ago. I also think one of the things that Conservative Party strategists must be looking at is Labour are far more ahead in the polls, and they aren't coming out with this, this more incendiary rhetoric that we're seeing from the Home Secretary. So you do have to start questioning, is the appetite there for it? Is that kind of polarisation there? We've made some comparisons with Suella Braverman and Donald Trump, but fundamentally, Britain isn't as polarised, it isn't as extreme as America, thankfully.
Yeah.
So we're not. Hopefully, we'll never get to that point. So I think it's going to have to be a political judgment. But given her behaviour of the last few weeks and how unsettled it's made some Tory MPs, and we also have to remember a divided party, as everyone says in Westminster, doesn't win elections. If there's a significant amount of Tory MPs that are unhappy with the rhetoric of the Home Secretary, that's not something you want going into a general election. You want your MPs on TV defending the Home Secretary, saying that they have confidence in her. If you've got them criticising them today, tomorrow when it comes to an election, they may not feel as secure about that. So yeah, I think her position probably isn't as secure as it was when she got appointed last year.
Well, I'm not going to put that question to our two serving politicians, because I think we can all predict their answers. We'll move on in just a moment, but do keep your calls coming at 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. It's 8:16.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
We have with us on the panel tonight Baroness Angela Smith. Now, give us the goss from the King's speech. Was there anything that went wrong? Anything funny happened?
Absolutely nothing went wrong at all. Nobody fell over. There's always a nervousness when the Lord Chancellor has to step backwards. You think that's the moment they're going to fall. They didn't. He didn't look very happy.
He didn't, did he?
Didn't look happy at all. I'm not blaming that on the content of the speech, because he probably thought there was a better gig somewhere else. It's quite a spectacle. It's quite fun to be there. It is a spectacle. I'm sorry, I never like wearing the robes. I have to say, one of these doesn't like.
Do you have to be present?
If you're a peer to be in the chamber, you have to. But I won't wear fur, as you know. So mine's got these stinky old fur ermine robes, and mine's got nice, clean, unsmelly nylon on it.
And do you own them? Do you have to
Good
buy
heavens,
them?
No. I get lent
them.
one. There's a ballot for free ones, and some people hire them, but I get lent one for the day.
How much does it cost to hire them?
I have no idea, because I've never paid to hire one.
I just think there must be a limited market for this outside the King's speech.
Well, if you go to your mum's dressing up box, you might find something. But it does look a spectacle. I think it's quite a good occasion.
We had a whingy caller yesterday sort of saying, it's outrageous, cost of living crisis, but the money should be spent on poor people. I'm thinking, well, I'm trying to imagine the extra cost of this. Yes, I'm sure there's extra police costs, but, I mean, the carriage is there to bring the King to the palace. I mean, I suppose there's a bit of upkeep for that. But what else are the extra costs?
I don't know if there are extra costs, if it brings any tourists in for the spectacle. I'm not sure there are any extra costs at all.
But if you could have a word with them to...
what would you like to have done?
Open the roads again. I mean, it did happen yesterday.
I know.
Because it means I can't get my train home tonight on time because the roads are blocked. So if you could just sort that for me.
I'm getting here today.
I'd be really grateful.
Okay, I'll look into it for you.
We also have with us David Simmonds, Conservative MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner. Nadine Batchelor-Hunt, political reporter for PoliticsHome. Just explain what PoliticsHome is for the uninitiated.
It's an online political news website. We provide news, sometimes breaking news, analysis, sometimes opinion pieces, and we're also paired with The House magazine.
And Freddie Sayers is here, editor-in-chief of the news and opinion site UnHerd.com. UNHERD, as we keep saying. 30-second elevator pitch for UnHerd.
It's spelled UNHERD because we're against herd mentality, and as you would have noticed, there's quite a lot of that about. So if you want independent thinking, type it in and come and check it out.
Or come to LBC, one or the other. Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question from Emma in Camden. Should Keir Starmer do anything in response to one of his shadow ministers quitting so he can call for a ceasefire in the Middle East? Now, this is Imran Hussain, who resigned as a shadow minister for the New Deal last night, telling Starmer that his own view differs substantially from the position the Labour leader has adopted. How damaging is this likely to be for Keir Starmer, Freddie?
I don't think it is damaging for Keir Starmer so far. He's made the calculation that what he needs to show with an election coming up is that he is not Jeremy Corbyn, and to reassure the swathes of Middle England that he is hoping and expecting are going to vote for him next year, that the party's changed, it's become sensible, and it isn't filled with any anti-Semites or people who take positions that are out of step with most people. So that's his main objective, and to be honest, I think he's played it pretty well, and most voters will be reassured on that front. So, there will be disgruntled members of his party. There will maybe further people who step down or lose jobs in the front bench, but I don't think that's going to be a big crisis for him.
So you don't think he should do anything in response? I mean, he hasn't said anything, I don't think, has he? I
think he needs to stick to his position, because if he's seen as giving ground and hesitating, that's going to look weak. And I think he's done the right thing there.
Nadine?
I think that he's made from my judgment of conversations I've had with people who, are calling for a ceasefire, from benches who are calling for a ceasefire, the decision it sort of seems to be pick your battles. This is the battle he knows he's probably not going to win. If he starts sacking front benches for calling for a ceasefire, he could lose a significant proportion of them. It makes the party look divided. It makes him look weak as a leader. It makes Labour the story as opposed to the government the story. So I think he's kind of made a judgment call here where there are certain things you can't win. And obviously the Palestinian issue is a huge importance to a lot of Labour members and a lot of Labour MPs. So I think he's made a judgment as a leader, and I don't think it's damaging, but I do think in the coming weeks, how he responds as the situation in Gaza gets worse. I've spoken to Labour MPs who are on the front bench and have said, I'm calling for a ceasefire, but as it gets worse, I think that his position is going to be harder to hold because the images we're going to see coming out of Gaza are going to get worse. Then I think it may become more difficult if there are more resignations. But I think at the moment, I think he's really walking the only line he can walk, keeping his position on not calling for a ceasefire, calling for humanitarian pauses, allowing people to walk and not sacking them. But I think, if he starts getting into sackings, then it might become a bit more messy. But at the moment, I think it's okay.
Angela.
I think the judgment Keir's made, he's got to do and say what is the right thing to do and say. If Keir was to call for a ceasefire tomorrow, it would make no difference whatsoever. The immediate, I don't see any appetite from Israel, who still haven't got its hostages back, who are still facing bombs from Hamas. And that bombing from Hamas and the attack on Israel has unleashed such violence, and the suffering in Gaza is just beyond belief. And I just think you see those pictures on TV, you can't unsee it once you've seen it. It's horrific. But the most urgent thing at the moment is to get humanitarian aid in somehow or other, whether it's a pause, whether it's corridors, but it has to get into the people that need it the most. So I think his judgment is what is the right thing to do? How can we best help people in Gaza? How can we best ensure that Israel in the longer term feels safe and secure within its boundaries? I think for a lot of people, politics generally, there hasn't been the attention to the Middle East there should have been over a number of years. Tensions have been evident, but nobody expected something on this scale at all. I met some people this morning who still have family who are hostages. And the absolute sadness, horror, worry, fear from them is just awful. Then you talk to people who've got family in Gaza and what's been unleashed there. It's just terrible. So Keir's judgment is he's got to do what he believes is the right thing to do. It will be calculated on that.
Part of your job, presumably, is to report back to the leadership as to what Labour Lords are thinking. What representations have been made to you on this from your colleagues?
Most people are very supportive of what Keir is saying. Everybody wants the killing to stop. Whether they say they want to call for a ceasefire, I haven't had many of those saying. Most people are saying calling for a ceasefire won't achieve it. I've had one person actually say that to me, but saying you can't call for that now because it won't happen. They want to see a ceasefire. Who doesn't want a ceasefire to happen? Everybody wants the killing to stop. But more or less people are saying, what do we have to do in the longer term that we don't have this cycle of violence? How do you protect people in Israel? How do you make Israel a safe and secure state? How do they feel secure within their boundaries? And how do you give people in Gaza that the sovereignty of their own state so they feel safe and secure? But I think the horror of what happened, it was a month ago yesterday, wasn't it? And people still being held in hostages, family not knowing where they are. It's almost beyond belief how those people are feeling at the moment.
David?
I think Keir Starmer, if he aspires to be Prime Minister, needs to take the long-term view about this. And we've seen really good efforts towards establishing long-term peace around Israel, notably not supported by Iran, but by many of the other Arab states with the Abraham Accords. And it was clear Hamas have done what they've done because they want to disrupt that process. They don't want to see that kind of long-term peace settlement coming into being. But that is a peace settlement which has been supported by British governments of all parties for a long time. Clearly, it takes two sides to have a ceasefire. Hamas have been absolutely clear that they are not going to stop fighting. They're not going to stop firing rockets at civilian targets in Israel on a daily basis. And therefore, I think the reasonable, sensible thing is what the British government's done, what most other governments have done, which is to say we need to make sure humanitarian aid is provided and supplied, that's a key thing that needs to happen, but that we support the government of Israel in trying to ensure that this kind of terrorist attack simply does not happen to them again.
Would you accept that Keir Starmer has actually shown real leadership on this issue?
I think he's done the right thing. I know in my party we had Paul Bristow, who did the same thing, stepped aside from a role because he felt he needed to speak up in our case for a ceasefire as well. Okay, you may be spot on that, but I know he stepped away. But either way, I think the parties have taken a view that, exactly as Anna's described, this is the right thing to do. There will be people who have principal disagreements with that. However, it is clear that broadly cross-party there is consensus, that consensus is shared by our allies across the world, and that's what we need to do.
It is interesting, though, isn't it, Nadine, it's come to you on this, that Imran Hussain, clearly he's a Bradford MP, his constituency association is largely made up of Muslim Labour Party members. Paul Bristow in Peterborough, he has quite a high proportion of Muslim voters in his constituency. And some people will say, well, that's a good thing. Constituents actually putting pressure on their MP to do something that maybe they wouldn't have normally been minded to do. And other people will say, well, no, this is absolutely wrong. You shouldn't bow to the wishes of a minority of your constituents.
I think that one of the reasons why MPs sometimes resign from the front bench on issues like this is because they know that being a front bencher means you have to walk a certain line. And, particularly you sometimes see, we saw it a lot in Boris Johnson's government, ministers have to go out and say things that they may not necessarily agree with because of the whole principle of collective responsibility. So I think it makes sense that if an MP is feeling that they can't, represent their constituents and also their own beliefs in the way that they want to while being on the front bench, they step back. It makes sense. So, and I also think ultimately the people that are who elect these MPs are the constituents. And I think, fundamentally, that is who you serve, and they are the ones who decide if you are going to be elected again. And remember, MPs can leave a party, but they're still an MP for that seat. So I think a lot of people will probably look at what Imran has done and think, he's recognised that it's incompatible with the front bench position to hold the views that he wants to hold, and therefore he stepped down. And I think the letter was open and straightforward and brave in terms of
and it's a big thing, isn't it? Because he's been a front bencher, I think I'm right in saying, for 8 years. He could have been within 6-9 months of being a minister in a Labour government, and that's now gone out the window.
And I think that's what as Labour prepares for government as well, MPs are starting to this kind of stuff is real a challenge to them to think, okay, if we were in government, what would we be doing? What would be expected of us? And I think the expectation, the calibre of the behaviour of MPs is being held to quite a high standard. And I wonder if we'll see any more. I mean, I've chatted to MPs, front benches about whether or not they'll think there'll be more resignations. There may well be. There's doubt they'll be super senior. We're talking like shadow cabinet. The people I've spoken to think it's doubtful, but maybe more junior ministers who feel like their position is not compatible with the front bench may step back.
0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel over the next half an hour. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. Let's get the news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The Prime Minister says he accepts a pro-Palestinian protest will go ahead on Armistice Day this Saturday, but Rishi Sunak is describing the planned march as provocative. World leaders are calling for humanitarian pauses and urgent action to get aid to civilians in Gaza. They've been speaking at a G7 meeting in Tokyo. And the most senior civil servant during the pandemic has apologised for suggesting the Prime Minister go on TV to encourage the COVID equivalent of chickenpox parties to promote herd immunity. Lord Sedwill has told the COVID-19 inquiry he recognises it may have been perceived as heartless and thoughtless. LBC weather, rain clearing in the southeast tonight, blustery showers in the west with a low of 1, sunshine and scattered showers tomorrow, drier in the east with a high of 12.
LBC.
Hey, Harry.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Angela Smith, David Simmonds, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and Freddie Sayers with us. Nadine, is it a good time to be a Nadine?
I've actually got a very funny story. I have to give you a Cliff Notes version, but a broadcaster contacted me once begging me to go on their show. I was thinking, they're really keen. I wonder why they're suddenly so obsessive about this. Like, can you talk to us exclusively? And I was thinking, I'm just a journalist. Like, why would they be so keen to talk to me? Anyway, they talked about sending news crews out to my house, and I was like, okay, this is getting a bit out of hand. And then I just said, I am just a journalist. Like, I can't provide any kind of inflammatory comments. And they were like, oh God, you're not Nadine Dorries, are you? And I was like, I'm absolutely not Nadine Dorries. And they were like, God forbid the producers had come out and they'd started filming.
That would have been hilarious.
And they hadn't known anything about politics. And then the poor person in the news studio pans to me and I'm just Nadine.
Which ridiculous broadcaster did that?
I feel guilty if I share it.
Name and shame.
I'm not going to name and shame, but we had a lot. I'll tell you on the break.
Right, a text question from Bobby in Crewe, who says, ministers have finally come to an agreement with Mick Lynch and the RMT. Does this prove all these industrial disputes can be sorted out if those in charge really want to? Well, an interesting way of putting that, because it's not quite as simple as it sounds. Now, rail operators have offered a deal which proposes backdated pay rises and job security guarantees for rail workers, with RMT members now voting on this deal in the run-up to Christmas. The separate dispute with the train drivers union ASLEF has not been resolved, though, so train services over Christmas could still be disrupted. And the other slight fly in the ointment is that Mick Lynch is not recommending this deal to his members. But he's not recommending it either, which I think is a little odd, but let's see what you all think. Angela?
I think the basic premise is there, though. The only way these issues are ever resolved is if people sit around a table and talk about it. And the public, because have gone on, had a lot of disruption to their lives here, health service, etc. And they say the only way to resolve issues is talking about it. I think it's progress. If Mick Lynch is saying to his members, here's the deal, make up your mind, see what you think, and then they've got the opportunity to do that. But strikes are very difficult. I don't know anybody who's ever been on strike who's enjoyed the experience or wanted to go out on strike, because they lose money. It's actually quite a lot of hardship for those who should be working. And I think what this does say to us is how industrial relations in this country are a pretty poor low when we've seen so many strikes in the last year. So, yes, sit around a table, it's uncomfortable. I remember as a minister, it wasn't a strike action, but it was a bit of a disagreement with a group of people. And I basically said, here's the room, sit there, don't come out till it's sorted. And sometimes that's the only thing you can do, is sit around the table, hammer out the most difficult issues, go in, think, and resolve them. And so if they have come to an agreement, I think the public will be delighted. And those of us
Don't you
on
think
trains
it's an
will
abdication of leadership, though, for Mick Lynch he's obviously negotiated this. Surely he should be putting his name to it.
Well, I think it would be ideal if he feels able to recommend to his members, then we could pretty much guarantee that would be the end of the action with the RMT. But I don't know what's in the dispute. I'm not going to make a case for Mick Lynch. That's up to him to do so. But it's progress from where they were before. But I think all of us would like to see these disputes resolved. And I think it's all very well for government to say, oh, it's not us, it's the train operators. But government had a pretty heavy hand in a lot of this.
David Simmonds.
Well, it's very clear that as we've heard, these disputes need to be resolved. I think there's been a broader issue that, in the context of the political turmoil that we've seen of all kinds over the last few years, as the Labour Party has tacked a bit towards the centre, the kind of extent of union militancy has begun to rise. And clearly the government's been trying to deal with that against a very difficult economic backdrop. So if you're faced with a union that says, we want a 35% pay rise or something, and it's very clear cross-party that the leading figures are saying this is not affordable, none of us could do this as a deal as a government, that getting around the table and negotiating is not going to bring you together at that point. And the government needs to set those standards quite clearly. We know this is a very complex picture. I used to chair the National Employers Organisation of School Teachers, so we used to do the negotiations around school teachers' pay. And I know there is a process that's set out where you have independent bodies who take advice, recommendations from all the different people concerned, and then arrive at a recommendation to the government. And in my view, that's the process that we should follow, so everyone can see that the evidence is there, everyone can make their case, rather than the kind of industrial action that we've seen that's hugely disruptive to people's lives.
Nadine.
I think that the reaching of some sort of agreement now probably is partially because the government probably doesn't want to have these disputes, these industrial disputes going on as we get close to our election. We're within, a year out now, less than a year out. It does not look good if you're going to the public and saying vote for us, vote for more of us, when trains are just, I don't know about you, but I've just got so used to train strikes now as just being part of how our railways work, and it's not how they work. It's not how they should work. So, it'll be interesting to see if this kind of decision to have more dialogue with the railway with railway unions will translate to other sectors like the NHS, where you've still got people threatening to go on strike and things like that. But I imagine it's bumping up the priority list, and I also do think there's been a bit of waiting it out and seeing will they keep striking, will it keep going on? And the RMT have been very clear that they will strike as long as is necessary. So I think hopefully a conclusion can be reached. But I do think it's interesting that Mick Lynch isn't recommending or not recommending either way. I'm be interested to, if I could pick his brains on to why that would be.
May I just add, the other thing that's happened, of course, is the minimum services bill has been making its way through Parliament. The government said, look, we simply can't have this level of disruption. We are going to legislate, as is the case in many other countries, that public services at a minimum level have to be provided. And clearly the unions perhaps have been waiting to see whether that does make its passage through Parliament. Now it has. They're faced with a situation where some of their leverage has been reduced. And I suspect that's one of the reasons that some of them...
But even on that, I've always thought that's fine, minimum service levels in the health service, but they actually kind of already exist. Anyway. Yeah. But in the railways, they're saying 40%. Now, that's quite a high minimum, I would have thought, to provide a minimum service. But
and these things are really important to the economy, and we saw the disruption that people were deliberately targeted, going to work, travelling for holidays. And I think the view of government, and certainly a lot of my constituents who've bent my ear about this, was that it's just not acceptable. We are very dependent on these things, and we need to do as they do in other countries and say, you can go on strike, but there needs to be a minimum level of public
Freddie.
It's not even about Labour or the Tories. If you look at polling over the decades, the first levels of support for these strikes have been coming down. And actually, to listen to the Labour leader in the Lords, they're sounding pretty lukewarm about this latest strike. Actually, it's quite interesting. It's no longer clear that there's a big chunk of the public there supporting workers when they strike. And I think part of that is because the workforce is so different to how it was in earlier decades. There's so many more Uber driver style, semi-self-employed individuals who don't have effective unions, don't have that option, that there's not the solidarity that there used to be. So I think we're in a big picture shift in the way industrial relations is argued out.
Right, Mark in Brighton says on a text, should bonuses for water company bosses be banned while the rest of us have to swim in effluent? The water regulator Ofwat has said that over the last financial year, bonuses at Severn Trent, South West Water and Portsmouth Water were not substantially linked to stretching delivery for customers and the environment. I think that says more about Ofwat than anything else, possibly, you might like to think. David?
It depends if they're doing the job they're supposed to be doing, but more importantly, there's been a huge extraction of value by a lot of investors and shareholders from the water sector, money that could have been spent on improving the infrastructure over the last decade or so. And that's been a change in the pattern of the way those companies operate, and I've heard about it from constituents. So I think we need to look at the way in which this sector is serving our interests. I think the Environment Act, which introduced for the first time a much higher degree of monitoring and much higher standards on water discharges, will go some way towards that. But we've needed that partly because water companies, to be fair, a decade or so ago, the previous governments, they were not monitored at all on many of these things. Now that monitoring is happening, it's shown that there's an issue and we need to make sure it's dealt with.
Freddie?
Yeah, I'm a real lefty when it comes to bonuses. I don't think many of them are.
Because you don't get any.
Many of them are worthwhile. They should be linked very clearly to performance. They should be proportionate, and it does feel like a spillover effect of the City of London and coming down from the financial sector. Everyone says, oh, maybe we should, maybe we'll get higher quality of leadership if we pay more outrageous sums to the leadership. But these are public sector areas, and these are crucial utilities, and no, we shouldn't be paying massive bonuses, particularly with that kind of performance.
Angela?
I had to read this 2 or 3 times to make sure I was reading this properly. Bonuses, I thought, and I'm not a great fan of bonuses either, I thought if someone's done exceptionally well in their job, they get an extra bonus. It might be 20 quid in your Christmas box or something. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds here for people on salaries, more than any of us around the table are earning, and they're being rewarded when they've failed.
You don't know what I earn.
I'm assuming it's more than me.
Yes,
yeah,
that is true.
and I'm assuming they're probably getting more than you. But if you look at the pay package, it's one thing to give people a bonus, which I still struggle with a bit, if they've done exceptionally well. It's another thing to give people a bonus when they're failing in their job. I live near the coast. I live in Bognor Regis when I get home from Westminster, and we've marched up and down with people with giant inflatable poos on their head at times because it's a sight to be seen.
Remind me never to visit Bognor Regis.
No. But it's because people are really, really upset that you have a beautiful coastline, you have a sea there, and there's all kinds of unpleasant things being pumped into the sea. And so times you're being told it's not safe to swim in the coast of the country. Water companies have a responsibility. So while they're getting the bonuses, the cost of the public of their water rates is going to go up, and you've got people being rewarded for failure. So I'm uncomfortable in the first place. Rewarding for success is one thing. Rewarding for failure is just unforgivable and unacceptable.
Nadine.
I think it'll be interesting to see in the coming years the attitude towards the privatisation of public services like water and energy, which we know the public are more supportive of nationalising, if that changes, because I think things like bonuses when there's so much sewage in our waterways, I just think leaves a bad taste in people's mouths.
Oh.
I didn't even intend to make that pun, it just happened.
You know, the place where you live has a link to my first edition of my podcast on Kings and Queens.
Oh,
Can
yes,
you guess
of course.
what that is?
Bugger Bognor.
Indeed. Simon, and I think we can say that, it is 8:46.
Sorry.
Simon
Leaps me.
Heffer is my first guest on, well, it's now called the President's, Prime Minister's, Kings and Queens podcast. And he talks for an hour about the life and reign of King George V. And of course, that's what he was rumoured to say on his deathbed.
The story is that he loved Bognor so much, and the king wasn't very well, and they said, "King, if you get better, we'll take you
I think
to
they probably said,
Bognor."
Your Majesty.
Yeah, if you get better, you can go to Bognor because we know you really like Bognor. And he said, bugger Bognor, and died. But he loved Bognor, and that's why.
Because he had been, I think 5 or 6 years previously, he had been to Bognor on a recuperation, and it worked rather well.
It did indeed.
So he was just a bit ungrateful, wasn't he?
He loved Bognor. It was just a slip of the tongue when he was in his last few moments.
Corey's saying in my ear, please, no more about Bognor. It's 8:47.
LBC leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Angela Pottymouth-Smith is with us, David Simmonds, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and Freddie Sayers answering your questions. Let's go to Joan in Maidstone. Hello, Joan.
Hello there. Does the panel believe that a good way to take knives off of our streets is to teach self-defence and martial arts?
Well, 15-year-old Alfie Lewis was stabbed to death in Leeds yesterday afternoon, with the West Yorkshire Police saying a 14-year-old juvenile has been arrested on suspicion of murder. Meanwhile, a 16-year-old boy has died in Birmingham after being shot on Sunday. I don't think anybody's got a single answer to this, but do you think maybe self-defence classes, martial arts would be a good idea, David Simmonds?
I think they may be a good thing. I don't think they make the streets safer. And my reflection on my time as a councillor in London, the one period where we saw a real impact on knife crime was when knife arches used by the police were used as a thing to put in public transport hubs in particular, but public places, so that everybody knew that in that environment, anyone who was there had been through that knife arch, and therefore the likelihood of there being any form of weapon present was much lower. And that really, really reduced...
Do they still exist? I've never seen one at a tube station.
They do still exist, and I'd like to see the Metropolitan Police doing a lot more of that so that people can be confident that public spaces are safe.
But how do they work? Because are London Underground workers then supposed to... I mean, if it beeps... Do they then have to...
They're operated entirely by the police, so they move them around. So you didn't know where the knife arch was going to be on a given day, but they would set one up in a tube station somewhere and invite people to walk through it, and that was part of a policing-led operation. And I think set alongside the kind of long-term work that I know the police are doing to get inside the gangs that are generally the thing that's the big driver for knife crime in London, that will take time. But I think having that kind of knife arch system so that people can be confident that when they're out on the streets, that those are safe public places, that would be a really important step forward.
It doesn't strike me as a very... I mean, if you have just the odd knife arch in a tube station, I mean, that's not going to deter many people, is it?
Well, it was done in London as quite a substantial operation, so the Metropolitan Police invested in those, and they set those operations up and they moved them around. And partly the unpredictability meant that people were discouraged if they thought they might have carried a knife, because there was a possibility they'd find themselves coming across a knife arch like that. But most importantly, just as a member of the travelling public, when you're out and about, you knew that people arriving into that town, into that place, people who were getting on that bus, getting on that tube, that they'd been screened, and therefore you were in a safe environment. And it really helped to address the fear of crime that people feel as well, that not just impacts on the individuals directly involved, but also impacts on the whole of the community.
Angela?
I look at this and I'm so distressed. It's a 15-year-old boy that's been stabbed to death, and it's a 14-year-old that's been arrested for it. Now, something badly is going wrong somewhere. I think one of the lads there was shot, one was stabbed. Knife arches may be part of the solution. Self-defence may be part of the solution, but there's something much deeper going on here when young boys, who seem to be the most at risk as both perpetrators and victims, how do you stop this happening? There's got to be an issue around respect. Is there more that we can do within our schools, within community groups? Do they fully understand the consequences when they go out with a knife and what can happen to them? Where do they get the knives from? Do their parents know they've got knives? There's so many questions here. So I don't have any answers, but I think it's distressing, and we just have to get under the issue. You know, we talk about London, but are we going to have knife arches all over the country in every street corner? Because these happen in random places, not just on public transport. So self-defence, respect for each other, those kinds of issues may well help, but until we get to the bottom of each individual case almost of how these came about and how it happened, I don't think we're going to stop it. We can just try and make society less violent.
Nadine?
I think, you know, a lot of knife crime, like things like knife crime and crime among this cohort, often comes from lack of kind of places for them to go. You know, I think things like community centres, I think a lot of Sure Start centres, I think that was one of those policies that was scrapped during austerity, and a lot of campaigners feel that it had quite a negative impact on a lot of these communities now, where we're seeing this kind of huge resurgence of knife crime. And I think those sort of interventions, government-led interventions, where you can kind of get kids after school off the street and doing things that are constructive as opposed to kind of hanging around. Self-defence classes, classes. I mean, both of my parents are very, very strong advocates of self-defense classes. My dad did taekwondo, my mom did kung fu. They were both very good at them. So I think just even getting kids into classes, I'm terrible at self-defense. I did a boxercise class recently and it was so embarrassing. But I would say, you know, less so for the kind of the element of protecting yourself on the street, and more so of getting kids somewhere doing something and being together and in a kind of an environment where they're not kind of, you know, not having any kind of like supervision, and they're kind of feel like they're part of something with their peers. So I think that it's positive. Any sort of group sport is positive. But I ultimately think to tackle this surging knife crime and you know, now gun crime, and I'm sad to see this happen in Birmingham. I'm from Birmingham, so, you know, I think it has to come from government. I think those interventions have to come from above, and they have to be over a long period of time as well. It's going to take a long time to get the structural change we need to stop this stuff sort of happening.
Freddie, forgive me, but I'm not going to come to you on this because we've got the next question is right up your street, so I'm going to give you longer on that. You'll see why in a moment. It's from Imi in Birmingham. While Joe Biden is incredibly unpopular in America, his party actually did very well in elections yesterday. Should he abandon plans to run for re-election? Now, the Democrats won control of Virginia's state legislature yesterday, made gains in Republican-controlled Ohio, and also saw its governor re-elected in traditionally Republican Kentucky. However, a nationwide Biden v. Trump survey comparing who voters prefer on major issues gave Trump significant leads on almost all of them. Now, you are steeped in American politics. I know it's a real passion of yours.
I'm afraid I think that 1 + 1 = 2 on this. Who is going to be the leader of the Republican Party at the time of the election? It's going to be Donald Trump. And if there is a Donald Trump-Joe Biden matchup, who is the most likely winner? I'm afraid that is Donald Trump. He was spoken about earlier today negatively. I can't see how that doesn't happen. I'm waiting for someone to tell me which of those steps might not happen. Now, there has been discussion about replacing Joe Biden. There was a very senior guy in Obama's administration called David Axelrod who came out and said, you know, it might be time for him to consider his position. He's obviously very old. He's getting doddery. He doesn't command a lot of support. But there's no indication that he would be able to do that. And because of the strict constitutional processes in the US, it would actually be quite hard already to change horses at this stage. So I don't see how the Democrats are going to change the leader. So I don't feel we talk enough, actually, about the likelihood of a Donald Trump Part 2 and what that would mean for the world and what that would mean for America. Because if you think both sides became radicalized, polarized, considered the other political party to be the enemy, evil, all the rest of it. And this was true, by the way, from Democrats to Republicans as well as the other way around. Imagine how bad it was last time and now think what might happen this time. So I think we're in quite a perilous moment. And I'm afraid you can get me back after the election in 2024, and I hope I may well be wrong, but that's where I think the likelihood is at the moment.
Well, thanks for depressing us all. David, I mean, we've only got literally a minute or two on this, so if you've got something to say it, but if you haven't, don't feel that you have to, David.
I think it's a decision for the US, but it is important to the UK as well. I think the fact that Trump, for example, signalled that he'd probably take the US out of NATO in a second term is a major concern for Western alliances, and therefore we do have a very keen interest in ensuring that it's an outcome where there's a president of whichever party who wants the US to continue to play a leading role in the world.
I'm sceptical he'd win again. He'd win again if he didn't win last time. After everything that's happened, after everything he's done, after the insurrection, the idea that he'd beat Biden now and didn't before all of that happened, I struggle to... I understand why people think, you know, the polls say one thing, whatever, but fundamentally Americans didn't vote for him when he had way less baggage. I mean, the baggage is, you know, calling up people in Georgia asking them to find votes, you know, so different to how it was before. I just struggle to believe that America would... But again, I could be wrong.
I mean, the flip side of that is that they've had him before and, you know, the sky didn't fall on their heads. They survived it, so the kind of fear factor of voting for Trump this time might have gone away.
I'm with Nadine. I struggle to believe it, but that might just be wishful thinking on my part. I think Joe Biden is fantastic. I'm a great Joe Biden fan. I just wish he was 20 years younger. Because I think he's a great man. He's been a great politician. He's been a great, you know, advocate.
We all wish we were 20 years younger, apart from possibly Nadine.
I'd be 10.
Right, our final question comes from Faye in Worcester. The Caramac Bar, after 64 years, is being discontinued. Fans are in uproar. Which chocolate bar would you go to the ramparts to defend, and which one do you think should be axed next? Nadine?
I would axe the Curly Whirly. I hate them. They just get stuck in your teeth. I just find them despicable. And I would go to the ramparts for Maltesers. And if we're not going to count Maltesers as a chocolate bar, then a double-decker.
Oh, no, they're horrible. Freddie?
It's not technically a chocolate bar, but does anyone remember the Iron Brew bar?
No.
This was a very weird orange confection that they sold when I was a kid. It cost only 10p, so it was something everyone could afford. And it was the kind of sweet version of that strange Scottish drink, Iron Brew. I don't even know if they sell it anymore. We loved it. Everyone's teeth went orange. It was absolutely terrible for you. They don't make it anymore.
Angela?
I'm with Nadine on Curly Whirlies. I just don't like Curly Whirlies. But I have a confession to make. Recently, when it was sort of trick-or-treat night, we got little sweets in for the kids, and we got a bowl there. And we got those little mini bars you get in the bags. And I pinched all the Snickers out of them before they got to the kids.
Oh, no, see, the Snickers I
love Snickers.
I mean, I still think of them as marathons, and I didn't like them then.
That's my favourite.
They're just sort of weird Mars.
And Maltesers, but I think I was allowed to have Maltesers.
David?
I like Cadbury's Dairy Milk, but I have 2 young children, so I don't get to keep it for very long in our house. But I think the one thing I find strange is the rise of blonde chocolate that tastes a bit like fudge but pretends to be white chocolate. I never quite got my head around that. I really like white chocolate. I'm now convinced that blonde chocolate really
Are you going to ban it?
Replacement. Well, ask Suella Braverman and see what she says.
I want to try Iron Brew chocolate. It just sounds...
Well, Iron Brew drink, I tested that out in Edinburgh this summer. I'd never had it before. Disgusting. Invention of the devil, along with broccoli. Thank you very much indeed to you all. Angela Smith, David Simmonds, Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and Freddie Sayers. We'll have you all back very, very soon. Coming up in the next hour, this question is, I suppose, addressed mainly to women because you're a load of lushes. You're the champion binge drinkers of Europe. I don't know why I'm looking at Angela when I say that. Why on earth are British women the biggest drinkers in Europe? Now, the men are the third biggest drinkers in Europe. So what is it about Brits and drink? If you look back in history, actually, we've always had this issue. We've always been seen as a nation of drinkers. But why is it that British women in particular seem to like binge drinking? And I'll explain the definition of binge drinking in a moment, but we see it on our streets on Fridays and Saturdays. What can be done about it? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, a former head of counter-terror policing has told LBC rhetoric from politicians is driving the risk of violence this weekend. The Prime Minister says he accepts a pro-Palestinian protest will go ahead, but has described it as disrespectful. Rishi Sunak claims he will hold Met Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley accountable over the demonstration on Armistice Day. The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman's, also previously described pro-Palestinian rallies as hate marches. Labour's leader in the House of Lords, Baroness Angela Smith, has told Cross Question language like this is counterproductive.
The Home Secretary wants to have a thought. You want the country to be calm, you want the country to be in good order, you should be supporting the police so they can do their job well. Nobody at all wants to see any Remembrance weekend events disrupted or made less comfortable and easier for people to remember